The harmattan wind swept through the streets of Kogberegbe carrying with it the scent of roasted groundnuts and the distant echo of evening prayers from the central mosque. But there was another smell that made the entire neighborhood come alive each night, a smell that drew people from their homes like moths to flame. It was the smell of Mama Alaro suya, and it was unlike anything anyone had ever tasted. They said she had a secret. They said her grandmother had passed down ancient recipes from the old country, from a time when the spirit still walked freely among men. But no one asked too many questions. Not when the meat was that tender. Not when the spices made your tongue dance and your eyes close in pure satisfaction. Not when a single stick of her suya could make you forget all your troubles. Mama Alaro had appeared in Kogberegbe 5 years ago during the rainy season. She arrived on a Tuesday, which the old women noted was unusual because Tuesday was Ogun's Day, the day of iron and blood. She came with nothing but a small cart, a charcoal grill, and a smile that showed too many teeth. Within a week, she had customers lined up from her corner near the bus stop all the way to the junction where the taxi drivers gathered. The vendor herself was an enigma wrapped in colorful Ankara fabric. She wore her wrapper tied high and tight, the way the market women did, but her gele was always red. Blood red. She never explained why. Her face was ageless, simultaneously young and ancient, with tribal marks on her cheeks that no one in Lagos had seen before. Some said they were Igbo. Others insisted they were Yoruba. A few whispered they were something older, something from before the tribes had names. But it was her meat that kept people coming back. The suya was perfect every single time. The beef was impossibly tender, seasoned with yoji that had layers of flavor most cooks couldn't achieve in a lifetime. There was pepper, certainly, and groundnut powder, but underneath those familiar tastes was something else, something that made you crave more even when you were full, something that made you dream about it at night. Adanna Okafor noticed the pattern before anyone else did because noticing patterns was her job. She was a junior reporter for the Lagos Metropolitan Observer, stuck covering local interest stories while dreaming of investigative journalism. She lived in a small apartment 3 streets away from Mama Alaro's stand, and like everyone else in the neighborhood, she had become a regular customer. It started innocently enough. Adanna was working late one Thursday evening, transcribing interviews for a story about the new flyover bridge, when she heard her neighbor Mrs. Okonkwo wailing in the corridor. The old woman's nephew, a taxi driver named Emeka, had disappeared. He had left for work 3 days earlier and never returned. His car was found abandoned near the bus stop, the engine still running, his phone and wallet on the passenger seat. It was as if he had simply stepped out and vanished into thin air. The police filed a report. The family searched. But Lagos was a big city, and people disappeared all the time. The general assumption was that Emeka had gotten mixed up with the wrong crowd or had run away from death. Mrs. Okonkwo insisted her nephew was a good boy, but aunties always said that. Within 2 weeks, the neighborhood had moved on. Then it happened again. A young woman named Blessing, who sold vegetables in the market, disappeared on her way home from work. Then an Okada rider named Connor. Then an elderly man who ran a provision shop. By the time Adanna started keeping a list, 8 people had vanished in as many months, all from the same neighborhood, all without a trace. What troubled Adanna most was that no one seemed to care. Each disappearance caused a brief stir of concern, but then life continued. People went to work, children went to school, the markets bustled with their usual chaos. It was as if the neighborhood was under some kind of spell, unable to hold on to its worry for long. One humid evening, Adanna sat at her usual spot near Mama Alaro's stand, a plastic table under a neem tree, eating her suya and reviewing her notes. She had started documenting the disappearances obsessively, marking dates and locations on a hand-drawn map of Kogberegbe. As she chewed the tender meat, something began to crystallize in her mind. Every single person who had disappeared had been seen near Mama Alaro's stand on the night they vanished. Not just near it, but buying suya from her. Adanna could confirm this because she had interviewed neighbors and family members. Mrs. Okonkwo remembered Emeka mentioning he was going to grab suya before heading home. Blessing's friend had been with her when she stopped at the stand. Connor had been a nightly regular. Adanna's hands trembled as she set down her suya stick. She looked at the remaining meat, glistening with oil and spices, and for the first time, she felt her stomach turn. That night, Adanna couldn't sleep. She lay in bed staring at the ceiling, listening to the sounds of Lagos at night, the distant horns, the generator humming next door, the call of night birds. Her journalist instinct, the one her editor always said would either make her career or get her killed, was screaming that she had stumbled onto something terrible. The next morning, she went to the Central Police Station. The officer at the desk, a bored-looking sergeant with sweat stains under his arms, barely looked up as she explained her theory. When she finished, he laughed, a deep belly laugh that made his uniform buttons strain. "You think Mama Alaro is making people disappear because they buy her suya? Do you hear yourself, Miss Okafor? That woman is a hard-working vendor trying to survive in Lagos like the rest of us. Maybe you should stick to writing about bridges and leave police work to professionals." Adanna persisted. "But the pattern. The sergeant leaned forward. "Let me tell you about patterns. People in Lagos disappear every day. Sometimes they run away from family. Sometimes they fall into the lagoon drunk. Sometimes they join cultists or go to look for better opportunities in Abuja. That's the pattern. Not some fantasy about a suya seller." Defeated but not deterred, Adanna left the station. If the police wouldn't help, she would investigate on her own. She spent the next week researching everything she could find about Mama Alaro. She talked to other vendors in the market, visited the neighborhood where Mama Alaro rented a room, and even went to the local government office to check business registration records. The findings were disturbing in their absence. Mama Alaro seemed to have no history. No one knew where she had lived before coming to Kogberegbe. Her room was always locked, and her landlord, an elderly man named Papa Ajayi, said she paid her rent in cash 6 months in advance and kept to herself. The business records showed she had registered her vendor's permit, but the address she had given was an empty lot in a different part of the city. It was as if Mama Alaro had appeared fully formed 5 years ago and existed only in the hours when she stood behind her grill, turning meat and collecting money. Adanna decided to watch the stand more carefully. She started coming by at different times, buying suya, chatting casually with other customers, and observing. What she noticed made her blood run cold. Mama Alaro never seemed to restock her meat. Other vendors in the market would arrive early in the morning with fresh supplies from the abattoir or the cold store. They would have deliveries, receipts, visible supply chains. But Mama Alaro arrived each evening with her cart already loaded, the meat already cut and seasoned, ready to grill. Where was she getting it? More importantly, what was it? One evening, Adanna struck up a conversation with Mama Alaro herself. She complimented the suya and asked casually about her supplier. The older woman's smile never wavered, but something shifted in her eyes, something ancient and cold. "My meat is special," Mama Alaro said, her voice like honey poured over gravel. "It comes from old sources. Very old. My grandmother taught me where to find the best quality. These modern suppliers, they don't understand meat like we do. They don't understand what makes flesh truly tender." The way she said flesh made Adanna's skin crawl. She forced herself to smile and nod, but that night, the suya she had bought remained uneaten on her table. She couldn't bring herself to finish it. Adanna knew she needed proof, something concrete that would make people listen. She decided to follow Mama Alaro after the stand closed for the night. It was a dangerous plan, possibly a foolish one, but her instinct was screaming that time was running out. Someone else would disappear soon if she didn't act. On a moonless Wednesday night, Adanna positioned herself in the shadows near the bus stop, wearing dark clothes and carrying a small camera. She waited for hours, watching as Mama Alaro served customer after customer, her red belly glowing in the firelight from her grill like a warning beacon no one heeded. Finally, around 11 o'clock, the last customer left. Mama Alaro began packing up her things with practiced efficiency. She doused the charcoal, covered her grill, and loaded everything onto her cart. Then she began pushing it down the street, not toward her rented room as Adanna expected, but in the opposite direction, toward the old part of Kogberegbe where half the building stood abandoned. Adanna followed at a careful distance, her heart pounding so hard she could hear it in her ears. The streets grew darker and emptier as they moved away from the commercial area. Mama Alaro pushed her cart with surprising speed and strength for someone her age, never looking back, moving with the purposefulness of someone who had taken this route many times before. They walked for nearly 20 minutes before Mama Alaro turned into an alley between two abandoned warehouses. Adanna hesitated, every survivor instinct telling her to turn back, to call someone, to do anything but follow. But she thought of Emeka and Blessing and Connor and all the others, and she stepped into the alley. The narrow passage was barely wider than the cart itself, and it smelled of rot and decay. Adanna could hear rats scurrying in the darkness and the distant sound of water dripping. She used her phone's flashlight cautiously, shielding most of the lights with her hand. Ahead, she could hear the cart's wheels rattling over broken concrete. The alley opened into a small courtyard behind the warehouses. In the center stood a structure that made Adanna's blood freeze. It was a shrine, but not like any she had seen before. Carved wooden posts formed a circle, each one adorned with symbols that seemed to ride in her flashlight's beam. In the center was an altar made of stone, stained dark with substances Adanna didn't want to identify. And behind the altar was an opening, a stairway leading down into the earth. Mama Alaro had disappeared, but her cart sat abandoned near the shrine. Adanna crept closer, her camera raised, documenting everything. The symbols on the post looked ancient, pre-colonial, possibly pre-civilizational. They spoke of hunger and consumption, of flesh given and flesh taken, of bargains made with things that had never been human. A sound from below made Adanna freeze. It was chanting, low and rhythmic, in a language that hurt to hear. And underneath the chanting was something worse, a wet, tearing sound, like meat being separated from bone. Adanna knew she should run. Every cell in her body screamed at her to flee. But she was a journalist, and she needed proof. With her camera rolling, she crept to the edge of the stairway and looked down. What she saw in those few seconds before she turned and ran would haunt her for the rest of her life. The underground chamber was lit by dozens of candles, their flames burning an unnatural red. Mama Alaro stood before a massive clay pot, so large a person could fit inside it, and indeed, she was pulling something from it, something that had once been human but was now nothing more than prepared meat, seasoned and ready for the grill. Around the chamber, hanging from hooks in the ceiling, were more bodies in various stages of preparation, people Adanna recognized from their missing persons posters, their faces frozen in expressions of terror. But worst of all was what stood behind Mama Alaro. It was not human, could never have been human. It was tall and impossibly thin, with skin like dried leather and eyes that burned with an ancient, insatiable hunger. This was what Mama Alaro served, what she fed with each customer who bought her suya. This was the source of her secret recipe. Adanna ran. She ran faster than she had ever run in her life, her camera clutched to her chest, Mama Alaro's inhuman shriek echoing behind her. She ran through the alley, stumbled onto the main street, and kept running until she reached the police station, bursting through the doors so violently that officers jumped to their feet. "You have to come now," she gasped, her camera thrust forward. "I have proof. I have everything." Mama Alaro, the suya vendor, she's been killing people, she has bodies, there's something down there, something ancient, please, you have to believe me. The same sergeant from before stepped forward, his expression hovering between concern and skepticism, but when he saw the genuine terror in Adanna's eyes and the footage on her camera, something shifted. He called for backup. Within an hour, a convoy of police vehicles descended on the old courtyard. What they found there was enough to make even hardened officers turn away in horror. The bodies, the shrine, the ritual chamber, all of it was exactly as Adanna had described. But Mama Alaro was gone. Her cart, her grill, her red galley, all vanished as if they had never existed. The next morning, the story broke across every news outlet in Lagos. Adanna's footage, though edited to remove the most disturbing elements, provided undeniable evidence of the crimes. The families of the disappeared finally had answers, terrible as they were. The neighborhood of Kogberegbe reeled in collective shock, unable to understand how they had been so blind, how they had continued to eat and enjoy while horror had operated in plain sight among them. Some said it was a spell, that Mama Alaro had used dark magic to cloud their minds and suppress their suspicions. Others said it was simply the way of cities, that people saw what they wanted to see and ignored what made them uncomfortable. The old women in the market whispered that Mama Alaro had been an obiku, a child of the spirit world who never truly belonged to the human realm, or perhaps something even older, a remnant from the days when gods walked the earth and demanded blood sacrifice. The authorities brought in specialists from the university, anthropologists and historians who studied the symbols in the shrine. They confirmed the markings were ancient, predating even the oldest kingdoms of West Africa. The being that Mama Alaro had served, they theorized, was an entity from the oldest strata of African mythology, a hunger spirit that had been worshipped and fed in the days before civilization taught humans to fear such things. But Mama Alaro herself was never found. Some people claimed to see her in other neighborhoods, setting up her stand, the red galley always visible in the crowd. Others said she had returned to the spirit world from which she came. The police searched for months, but it was as if she had simply dissolved into the air, like smoke from her charcoal grill. Adanna became famous overnight, the journalist who had uncovered the most horrifying story Lagos had seen in decades. Newspapers from across the country interviewed her. Television stations featured her on their programs. Her editor, the same one who had dismissed her ambitions, now couldn't praise her enough. But Adanna found little joy in the recognition. She saw the faces of the victims in her dreams, heard the wet-tearing sounds from the chamber, remembered the ancient hunger in those burning eyes. She used her newfound platform to tell a different story, one about vigilance and community responsibility. She spoke at schools and community centers about the importance of paying attention, of not letting convenience and comfort blind us to wrong happening in plain sight. She told people that evil often wears a familiar face and offers us exactly what we crave, and that our greatest defense is to question, to wonder, to refuse to be lulled into complacency. The shrine was dismantled under the supervision of both Christian and traditional religious authorities, the ground blessed and purified according to multiple faiths. The warehouse was torn down, and a community garden was planted in its place, a deliberate choice to replace death with life, to let something wholesome grow where horror had festered. But some nights, when the harmattan wind blew through the streets of Kogberegbe, people claimed they could still smell it, that unmistakable scent of perfectly seasoned suya, impossibly delicious, calling to them from the darkness. And on those nights, the old women would lock their doors extra tight and remind their children of the lesson Kogberegbe had learned at such terrible cost. Not everything that seems good is good. Not every smile hides kindness. And sometimes, the most dangerous evil is the one we invite into our lives, the one we pay for, the one we consume willingly because it tastes so sweet we cannot imagine it could ever harm us. The neighborhood learned to be more careful, to ask more questions, to look after one another with genuine attention rather than casual indifference. They learned that community is not just sharing space but sharing responsibility, that every person who disappears leaves a hole that diminishes everyone. And they learned that the old stories, the ones about spirits and monsters and creatures that hunger for human flesh, were never just stories. They were warnings, passed down through generations, remind us that the world contains mysteries and dangers that modernity has not erased, only hidden from view. In her small apartment, Adanna kept a single photograph on her wall, a picture of all 8 victims, their faces smiling from happier times before they encountered Mama Alaro's stand. She kept it as a reminder of why she had become a journalist, why the truth mattered, why someone needed to ask the uncomfortable questions even when the rest of the world wanted to look away. The streets of Lagos continued their eternal dance, millions of people moving through the chaos with purpose and hope. Vendors called out their wares, buses honked their horns, and life went on in all its messy, complicated glory. But in Kogberegbe, when someone new set up a food stand, people approached with caution. They asked where the meat came from. They paid attention to who bought what and who was seen where. They remembered. Because that is the lesson that Mama Alaro had taught them, written in blood and terror and unbearable loss. That the price of peace is eternal vigilance, that community is built on watching out for one another, and that the most important question you can ever ask is the one that makes you uncomfortable, the one that everyone else is too satisfied, too comfortable, too enchanted to voice. In the end, Kogberegbe did not forget. The neighborhood erected a small memorial in the community garden, 8 stones arranged in a circle, each one bearing a name. On the anniversary of the shrine's discovery, people gathered there to remember, to recommit themselves to the principles of awareness and community care that had come at such a devastating price. And perhaps that is the true resolution to this horror, not in the capture of the monster, for some monsters cannot be captured, but in the transformation of the community that survived its predation. Kogberegbe became a neighborhood that asked questions, that noticed absences, that refused to let the comfort of delicious food or the convenience of tradition blind them to the truth that evil can wear any face, speak any language, and offer any temptation. The old women still tell the story to children, modified slightly to spare them the worst details but preserve the essential warning. They speak of a vendor with a red galley who offered meat so delicious people forgot to ask where it came from, who disappeared into the night leaving only hunger and grief in her wake. They tell the children to always ask questions, to trust their instincts when something feels wrong, and to remember that the community's greatest strength is not in what it produces but in how it protects its most vulnerable members. And on quiet nights, when the wind carries strange scents through the streets and the shadows seem deeper than they should be, the people of Kogberegbe remember to look out for one another, to notice who is missing, to value every life in their community as precious and irreplaceable. Because they learned, in the most terrible way possible, that failing to see, failing to ask, failing to care, creates the conditions in which monsters thrive. That is the true story of Mama Alaro and her suya stand, a tale of horror and loss but also of awakening and resilience. It is a story that asks each listener to consider what they might be failing to see in their own communities, what convenient pleasures might hide terrible truths, and what responsibility each person bears to ask the uncomfortable questions that keep everyone safe. The meat that tasted too good to be true was exactly that, and the people who disappeared were not just victims of a monster but casualties of a community's collective willingness to be blind. Their memory serves as both warning and inspiration, a call to vigilance that echoes through the streets of Lagos and beyond, reminding everyone who hears it that the price of safety is attention, the foundation of community is care, and the greatest evil is not the monster in the darkness but the choice to look away when its shadow falls across your neighbor's door.